This show is sponsored by Liquid IV. What do you pack in your bag when you're heading out for the day? Sunblock? Snacks? Sunglasses? Well, now there's another essential, Liquid IV. Liquid IV is more than just a drink. It's scientifically formulated to hydrate better than water alone. Visit liquidiv.com and stay fueled for a long day with sugar-free hydration featuring the new Raspberry Lemonade Hydration Multiplier. Get 20% off your first order with the code THERACE at checkout. When I'm travelling, I always like to have a pack of Liquid IV on me to help me stay hydrated when I'm getting on and off planes or going to and from the track. It's important for me because when travelling I am prone to suffering from dehydration and cramp if I don't use Liquid IV. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water hydrates better than water alone. It has 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 essential vitamins and nutrients that turn ordinary water into extraordinary hydration. From acai berry and lemon lime to pina colada, there are a wealth of flavours to choose from, and they are always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free and soy-free. So get ready for a long day with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code THERACE at checkout. That's 20% off your first order with code THERACE at liquidiv.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts will take the world by storm.
There's some big threat out there, and you're gonna help me stop it.
Us?
Why, you got someplace to be?
On May 2nd,
Avengers are gone. No one's coming to save the day.
their time
I think we could be the people that are coming.
has come.
Being the hero, there is no higher calling.
Let's do this.
Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, only in theaters May 2nd. Get tickets now. Rated PG-13. Some material may be inappropriate for children under 13.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and the championship fight is on as well, with Oscar Piastri laying down the gauntlet to McLaren teammate Lando Norris. But has what we've seen so far confirmed Piastri is ready to be world champion, or was Bahrain just a blip for Norris? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to tackle those questions and more are Ben Anderson and Mark Hughes. Well, Ben, welcome back. You've had a few days off, and we've pulled you straight back into a podcast.
Yes, I escaped to France, to Normandy with my family for the first part of the Easter holidays. So I was observing Bahrain from afar, and I'm delighted on my first day back to join you on the main F1 show.
Yeah, a rare appearance at the top table. We try and keep them to a minimum, but I'm sure people will tolerate you. And Mark Hughes, no such break for you. Obviously, we had you on the post-race podcast, and here you are again, looking forward to Saudi Arabia. But interesting time in the championship. So this Norris versus Piastri thing's a fun topic to get into, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the stage that we're in, and the straight off the back of one and into another. It feels like 5 races and 6 weekends. It feels like we're just in a state of permanent Grand Prix. There's just a Grand Prix permanently at all times. Anytime you're awake, there's a Grand Prix on. It just feels a bit like
That's what they want, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, start of the film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, the Michelle Yeoh film. Yeah, it feels like, and it's funny because certainly in my world, I'm sure it's the same for you, Mark, and Ben, you'll know this. I mean, it's still to an extent with what you're doing now, but when you were covering sort of all the races, I sort of view the world as there's pre-Grand Prix, post-Grand Prix, and then there's blank weeks. And there's not many blank weeks now, so I go straight from... Yeah. I'm sort of transitioning from post Grand Prix to pre Grand Prix here in between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. I'm still in Bahrain at the moment though, so it's it's a bit more towards the NASCAR thing. But we can't complain. It gives us more to talk about, more action, and it's been an interesting start to the season. So I'm happy with another race. But we've got loads of questions, and we're going to do an episode running through the Race Members Club questions. Thanks to everyone who sent them in. Loads of questions about the Papaya team inevitably and its drivers specifically. So we're sort of majoring on that, and then we'll get to a few other topics later on. So I'm calling part one the Oscar Piastri section because it's about obviously it's about Oscar Piastri. So Mark, a question from Big McLaren. Lando had a clear edge over Oscar Piastri last year. Has this eroded because Oscar has made a step forwards, or has Lando Norris gone backwards? And Heno Debar asked a similar question about Piastri's step up. So let's focus on Piastri. The step he's made 24 into 25, is it tangible for you?
Yes, it is. And I think in answer to the question of which is it, I think it's both. But Oscar has put together his peaks much better than last year. His peaks over 23 and 24 were amazingly high, but he just didn't have that consistency of being able to nail the balance early on the weekend, get confident with it throughout the weekend so as to crescendo in that last run of Q3. He could do that sometimes. It wasn't a guaranteed written in stone thing that he would coming into any weekend. And what we've seen so far is that he's, we're very early stage of the championship, 4 races in, but he's certainly been at a very high level at all of them. And part of that will just be, the greater technical understanding that experience brings. And part of it will have been a lot of work with his engineer, and then it all sorts of clicks into place, and you get to that place where it's all flowing freely, which makes you more confident, allows you to be more creative in your driving because your mind's got greater capacity. So I think that's Oscar's improvement. But yes, there has been a drop-off in Lando's form, and he talked about it in Bahrain, saying even when he was winning in Australia from pole, he didn't feel anywhere near as on top of this car as at any time last year when it was all second nature. So I think it's a bit of both, but we're taking a snapshot from just 4 races in, so we need to be careful.
Yeah, obviously the target Piastri had was more resilience this year. The way he works through Grand Prix weekends, all of this seems to have represented a clear step forward. And I think you're right. It's absolutely about not raising his game at its best. It's about raising the basement, if you like. And he's been strong everywhere. All 4 race weekends so far this year, he's been strong, whereas previous years he's been a bit all over the map. So that's what you'd expect from a driver as they get a bit more experience. And related to that, Ben from JK says, high deg, rear limited circuits were a big struggle for Piastri in the early part of his career. Was Bahrain evidence that he's overcome that hurdle, or did the clean air he had simply mask those issues to an extent?
Yeah, maybe a bit of both. I think certainly Bahrain's a big test of that, as we know. I think probably there's an element of the way McLaren's developed the car helping him too, because clearly the rear tyre management and the thermal degradation especially has been a big focus, and obviously Bahrain tends to be at the more extreme end of that, so he's probably getting a bit of help from the car. Running in clean air I think always helps anyone. We saw that in the China sprint race with Lewis Hamilton, didn't we? And if you can control the pace at the front, it's much easier to look after your tyres. I do think there's probably an element with his driving style too. It seems like he asks less of the front end and puts a bit more stress on the rear. So the fact that he has been performing so well probably suggests, again, like Mark was saying, he's put things together, taken a bit of refining of his craft over the winter just to tidy up the loose ends of driving and not kind of spike the tyres too much or for too long, keep everything better in check. It's still so early in the championship though, and still such fine margins. Difficult to read too much, but I do think he's taken the step I wondered if he would take at the end of last year, and he certainly looks like in the specific element of tyre management, like he's putting together those bits of, I can do it really well in qualifying, but I'm sacrificing the race. Now I'm doing well in the races, but sacrificing the qualifying. Now it seems much more joined up.
This, I think, comes from what you were talking about, Mark, in terms of building up that data bank and the knowledge. Time management, it's not just a a simple set of things you apply. It's just that feel and the ability to judge how hard you can push it at different times, as well as getting the pace relatively out of it when you're taking things easy. But I think it's that almost developing that more intuitive feel. And we've seen drivers like Max Verstappen's very good at this. He did a lot of effort early in his career to build that understanding. Lewis Hamilton's very good at it. And this is probably where Piastri's got to. And we saw a clear step year 1 to year 2. And provisionally, we've got a clear step this year. We just need a bigger sample set to completely confirm it.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's an incredibly complex equation, the tyre thing. It's not just, one answer fits all. There are so many subtleties and nuances to it depending on what the demands are on any particular day, and it's changing all the time with the way the track rubber's in, with the temperatures changing, the way the car balance is changing. All these things they're not the work of a moment to build up that full data bank. So yeah, I think it's not that surprising that it's taken this long, and you saw it. It's quite even after Max Verstappen had made the breakthrough of winning races, he could still put together a weekend where it just fell away from him because he was too aggressive with the tires, and it's not even for someone of Verstappen's ability. It's something that has to be learned, and that's what we've just witnessed Piastri going through. But I think because he came in towards the front in a very competitive car, that spotlight was sort of watching him go through his education process, whereas a lot of other drivers they've made that learning lower down the grid where there's not much focus on them.
Yeah, that's certainly very, very true. You can hide that a little bit more there. But the great thing is just constant improvement for Piastri. That's the thing that's impressed me with him globally, just that ability to keep improving, because that's the question, isn't it? Sometimes you get drivers who their peaks are great. Everyone's peak's pretty damn good in F1 these days, but it's how consistently can you string that together. And I like the fact that Piastri's made that good progress. The next question from Pratt Fries. There seems to be a fragility to Lando in his performances that Piastri doesn't show. Could this prove to be the deciding factor in the 2025 championship? Yeah, we'll talk about Lando a little bit more in the second part, but Piastri certainly seems to be very calm, no noise in his brain, as Andrea Stella said, not distracted, very process-focused. He doesn't get too overexcited when things are going well, doesn't get despondent when things aren't going well, or at least he doesn't appear to, because you never really know exactly what's going on in someone's head. There could be turmoil in there, but everything indicates it isn't. So I would say if you're applying the classical mindset of the champion driver, then Piastri appears to fit that much, much, much better. And we should say, though, he's never been tested in a proper World Championship fight. Yeah, it's starting this year, but as it goes on, it will get more and more intense, and that'll be uncharted territory for him. So even if he is super robust, which he appears to be, everyone's got their sort of point where they start to unravel a little bit. Even the greats would do, any of the established proven greats do that. So I would say that on the balance of probability, Piastri's mindset and strength could be a deciding factor in the championship, but sometimes you just got to let it play out. So I'd say if I was to choose to be a driver in that situation, I'd want to be the one with Piastri's mentality. I think that's probably the simplest way to put it. Does anybody want to make the case against that, or seen any cracks in Piastri's psychology?
I don't see any obvious cracks. What he has, to my mind, that's so impressive is very strong emotional control. I think you can be emotionally fueled in the car, and it can be useful, but it's a very hard fire to manage, and it can easily be destructive. I think Verstappen, for all his incredible qualities, he can be combustible sometimes, and you can see, although Red Bull's got good at managing it, and Gianpiero Lambiase particularly so, from years of working with him, it can spew into negativity and counterproductivity. Piastri doesn't have any of that kind of petulance in him. He's almost robotic, isn't he? He just goes about his racing. Things happen. He wins or he doesn't win. His reaction's pretty much the same, regardless of the result. He kind of has that thing that Jackie Stewart used to always say you need, which is to just drive with almost complete detachment. I think he's the closest we have at the moment at the front of the grid to that kind of model. But even he himself would say, Piastri, that sometimes he needs G'ing up. He's almost too laid back. So when you need to kind of dig deep, or you are up against it and need to find that extra bit from somewhere and you're not quite sure, maybe the weekend's been messy, you haven't had everything under control, I think he sometimes might not be fired up enough in crucial moments. But I don't think that's caught him out yet.
Yeah, we'll learn a lot over the next 20 races, but it's looking promising. And Mark, a final question on Piastri. Aidan O'Mahony says, has Piastri got better racecraft than Norris? And might this prove decisive in a potential championship battle between them? Just for the sake of definition, we'll go with the traditional English language version of racecraft, as in the kind of wheel-to-wheel stuff, because racecraft does now sometimes get used to mean all aspects of race and tyre management and what I'd call race management. But I think we should talk about racecraft, the wheel-to-wheel stuff here.
Yes, and I agree. And I think Oscar has generally got better racecraft. The wheel-to-wheel stuff generally seems to come more naturally to Oscar. He's outstanding in that regard, in his calmness in high-stress situations, his ability to spot and act instantaneously on a passing opportunity. He's quite ruthless in that regard. Norris's racecraft in Bahrain was patchy. He put a beautiful move on Leclerc, and his opening lap was untypically great. But he several times in his dices with Leclerc and Russell, he seemed just to be reacting to the moment rather than planning his moves. He's got great wheel-to-wheel judgment. That's not the part that's lacking. It's almost like there's a panic within him when he's not progressing as he wants to. And the clarity of thought, which he otherwise has, seems to go missing, as if his emotions are getting in the way. And going back to what Ben said, yeah, that lack of emotion is what's a very much part of Piastri's strength in the car. But I think in terms of will it be decisive in the championship, I don't. Not necessarily. I think it's too early, and I think B, it's too simplistic a way of looking at it. I think we know Norris is brilliantly gifted, and that spiral of confidence can go upwards just as fast, depending on how everything's feeling to him. So I wouldn't count him out just because Oscar's the man in form at the moment. I think Oscar's knitting his own peaks together better than Lando is at the moment. But who knows how high those peaks of Lando's can be.
It's sort of tempting to look at it a bit like, the Hamilton-Rosberg years at Mercedes, because you've got this potentially dominant car and then two, high-level drivers going at it for the championship. But there was always like a really clear racecraft difference between Hamilton and Rosberg. I always felt like Rosberg was quite spatially unaware compared to Hamilton and much clumsier, whereas I don't think that difference exists with Norris and Piastri. I think Norris is, as Mark explained, like brilliantly capable driver. It's just going to be very small things. Like, is he as proactive or as capable of being proactive as Piastri is in the races? I think of that Leclerc pass he did in Baku last year. It was like, so killer. Like, the moment's there, I'm going to take it. I'm almost going to mug the guy. He's not even expecting me to do it. But I think tied up with that is perhaps this might be Piastri's edge over Norris. The braking feel that Piastri has in that McLaren seems to be very precise, and he's able to do that kind of move without it spilling over into a lockup or a mistake. And we've heard a lot already this year about Norris not being so comfortable with the braking behaviour of the McLaren, and it might just be that the way the car is just suits the way Piastri uses his left foot a bit more than Norris does, and that will help him in certain situations, but there might be other circumstances, like Mark says, where it doesn't make a huge difference.
I think that Baku race you referred to is a great example of Piastri, because if you remember, he was being told to introduce the tyres gently by his race engineer Tom Sollard, which was kind of sound advice from his perspective, but Piastri realised actually there's a chance to get through here. And I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have won that race without making that pass when he did. So that's another element of racecraft, that strategizing. And probably we saw that weakness in Norris when he was battling with Russell on the last lap, and Russell kind of managed to suck him into trying to make a move at turn one, which Norris ideally shouldn't have done. So as soon as Russell had Norris alongside him there, he'd have thought, yeah, this is where I want him.
Yeah.
even though it might feel like he wouldn't have done. So it's the strategizing. But the Yeah, the spatial awareness, Norris is great. There are a few times at turn 4 he showed excellent judgment in terms of knowing when he could sort of turn across somebody as he was sort of exiting the corner, and that's a strong side of things. But yeah, it's just the race strategizing. Let's put it that way. We'll get back to the podcast in a moment, but first, let me tell you about Grammarly. Your time and expertise are valuable, and with professionals spending nearly half the work week on written communication, focus is one of the most important things to have at work. With Grammarly as your AI writing partner, you can stay focused and get through your work faster with relevant, real-time suggestions wherever you write. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster with AI prompts, tone suggestions, and more. And what's more, you can enjoy it with peace of mind with Grammarly's enterprise-grade security and its business model that doesn't sell your data. Experience the gold standard of responsible AI with Grammarly, a tool that 93% of professionals report helps them get more work done. So what are you waiting for? Get more done with Grammarly. Download Grammarly free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Llévate más de lo que esperas todos los días con el nuevo McValue en McDonald's. Ahora puedes comprar uno y sumarle otro por $1. Así que cuando tu equipo favorito enfrente a sus rivales, enfrenta tus antojos con $5 Meal Deals. Y si estás corriendo para alcanzar el desayuno, corre al app para llevarte ofertas antes del cutoff. Tú decides, y con McValue, tu decisión siempre rinde más. Precios y participación pueden variar. BOGO $1 válido para un producto de igual o menor valor. Debe estar registrado en Rewards para ofertas en el app.
Right, let's move into a more Norris-focused section now. Mark, question from John Ayres. Is there now sufficient evidence to indicate that when the pressure is on, be it in Q3 or in a race, Lando Norris consistently makes mistakes that are likely to prevent him ever winning a world championship? And Steve D, on a similar point, notes the unforced errors and if it's a concern for his title ambitions, or can he overcome this tendency?
Of course, it has to be a concern for his title prospects, yes. That mental resilience is part of what makes a champion. And he handles it differently from probably any other top driver I've seen. Although a little bit like James Hunt, who could also get a bit neurotic. But Lando uses this self-criticism almost as a motivation. Like, come on, you muppet. He's talking to a second person, but saying it out loud for the world to hear. And he says it works for him. And generally, it's a waste of time trying to be like someone else. You can focus on improving aspects of your own game, and he's quite capable of doing that. But you can't be like someone else. You can only be who you are at your core. And you can learn and acquire greater understanding, of course, but you can't fundamentally change how you're wired up. And in a high-stress activity like motor racing, that core will always be front and centre. And he can't suddenly be Max Verstappen or Oscar Piastri, for that matter. He has to find a way that works for him. And that might be unlocked by changes made to the car or a new understanding, which allows him to be back to driving in a natural flow. And then the confidence spirals upwards and it becomes incredibly difficult then to beat. I'd say all routes are open at this early stage of the season. So, no, while I see him as more vulnerable to his makeup than Piastri is, I don't see that as something which debars him from winning a title. It's still all there in front of him if he can find his own way through this semi-crisis.
Related to that, Ben, there's a question from Chris Campbell who says, does Norris have the mentality of a champion? Simon Ems asks, is Lando getting in his own head? Michael Sully asks something very similar to Simon Ems. Ollie Emerson says, I don't mind a driver being self-deprecating, but Lando Norris seems to go a bit overboard, even bordering on immaturity. So could this hold him back in a championship fight?
Oh, that's really tricky to answer fairly, because I think it's probably fair to say when he was new in Formula One, he did lack maturity. And he did lack mental strength. He admitted it himself. Like, he didn't feel like he belonged. He did seem, to my mind as well, a step behind people like George Russell, who came up with at the same time, in terms of just having that authority within himself or that calmness, like I deserve to be here, I know how to handle myself, I know what I want. But I feel like he's kind of grown into his own skin since then. So I don't feel like, just because he looks like he's in his feelings and he's, as Mark said, very excoriating of himself publicly, that means therefore he's falling apart. You don't see a pattern in the driving where he berates himself horrendously, calls himself a muppet, or calls the second version of himself a muppet, as Mark said, and then the next session is terrible and the next race is terrible, and you get these kind of runs of like, where is Lando? He's, even Bahrain, he messes up turn 1 in Q3, qualifies further down than he should, or gets a spiral as a result of that mistake, which means he qualifies further down than he should. But in the race, he was quite good. Yeah, there's a small mistake, he lines up in the wrong place and what have you, but the race through is still quite strong. You don't look at that race and go, oh, that's it. The qualifying defeats just completely had him over and he's done. So there is mental resilience there. And we've talked before about how he improved through the end of 2024 when he was fighting against Max for the first time. He was making mistakes, he was getting found out, but then he was working on those things and trying to come back better. So this very public learning and these problems, they're not defeating him. He's finding, not consistently always, but he's finding his own solutions to those problems and becoming a stronger driver as he does it. So again, it's what works for you. I really agree with that point Mark made. In fact, I remember going to a seminar that the Motorsport UK, it was the MSA at the time, put on for young aspiring racing drivers, and they got some experienced guys to come in and talk about their process. And you had people like Andy Prio, very experienced world champion touring car driver. His whole thing was like mental preparation, visualization, going through all the scenarios, working out what you do in each scenario before every race, quite involved. But other drivers, it's about being in the moment and reacting more, and sometimes that will work better for you. Maybe Norris is more that way. It was Jason Plato who said, a British touring car champion, who said the one thing he'd learned in his many, many decades of racing is you have to do what works for you. If you try to do other things or adopt everyone else's techniques, won't necessarily get the same result because everybody's different. So I can't think that we can extrapolate now, because Norris has had a rough start, he's not so comfortable in the car, that suddenly his mentality's shot because he's berating himself for not doing a better job. I think it would only take a small thing and he might suddenly hit the sort of form that you saw in Singapore last year where he's untouchable. It's so much is about how you feel in the car, isn't it? And I feel like Norris has always been quite uncomfortable in this run of McLarens. He's never been quite able to drive it the way he wants, so he's constantly having to adapt and find a different way to adopt techniques that aren't natural to him. And it's always the crucial equation is trying to keep all the things you are naturally good at and use them when they're needed, while taking on these other things that don't come so naturally and absorbing them. And I just think we've started the season in a place where what Norris does naturally isn't quite working as well. Over a course of a 24 race season, there are bound to be events where he's really strong, and we'll go back to tracks like Barcelona where Piastri was just nowhere all weekend. And that's the real test, because it's like if Piastri's bang right there, you say, okay, he's definitely made a step, because his weakest places are no longer his weakest places.
Yeah, China was like Spain last year, so he's ticked off China. But yeah, I agree, Spain's the other one that stands out from the early part of the season. Right, related to all of this, a question from Alan North that I'll take. How do McLaren snap Lando out of this spiral of negativity? He seems to beat himself up more than any other driver, when most of the time he doesn't need to. And James Nicholson asks if Lando needs to see a sports psychologist, as he seems to have the least self-belief out of all the top drivers. Well, on the latter points, it's up to him. I certainly think that drivers have had success with sports psychologists, and sports people in all sorts of different areas of activity have benefited immensely. One example that springs to mind is famously Ronnie O'Sullivan in snooker, regarded by many as the greatest ever to play snooker. But he was often at his best when he worked with Steve Peters, the famous sports psychologist, and that really helps him. So that could work for Norris. Who knows? He might be seeing a sports psychologist anyway. We don't know. He's perfectly entitled not to tell anyone about it. So my answer to that is maybe, but it comes back to what we've been saying, what Mark was saying in particular about what works for Lando Norris. So that's his choice.
Depends on your demons, doesn't it, Ed? Because O'Sullivan had so many demons away from the table that made that management process probably more difficult. I mean, I don't know about Lando Norris's demons, but he doesn't seem like he has a particularly unstable life or challenges away from the track. So it comes down to more minor details than that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, Ronnie O'Sullivan's story is quite an interesting one if anyone looks that one up. So yeah, but again, it depends on your challenges. And in terms of getting him out of the spiral of negativity, I don't think McLaren have any intention to, on the basis of it's what works for him. And there are values to it because he never throws the team under the bus. He likes feeling like he's like the man at McLaren. And I know Piastri's there, but Stella said it the other night that obviously Lando's been here all the way through this building McLaren back to being a world championship team, and Piastri's been part of that, but Norris has been there longer. So I think that helps him not sort of throw the team under the bus. And also, I think in a funny way, it probably reduces the pressure. Because if Lando Norris gets out of the car and says, I've been rubbish this weekend, not good enough, need to do better, need to learn, then he's not going to get 1,000 questions sort of saying, don't you need to be a lot better? Why are you so rubbish? Because he's kind of diffused it in a way. So I think actually there's a benefit there. And yes, it gets people talking about it, but I don't think it's a problem. And I don't fundamentally think it's a problem being aware of when you're doing it. I don't really subscribe to the fact that everybody has to be like a sort of a strongman character to be successful in sport, even though I would say that personality tends to be more prevalent. But perhaps that's because people more often sort of force out the people who are more publicly self-critical because they think, oh, you don't have the right mentality. So that makes Norris an interesting case, and it's worked for him. He's got almost to the top of Grand Prix racing. So I think McLaren are right to let Lando be Lando. And the thing that's most important is I don't really see him carrying that any negativity onwards, if you see what I mean. I think he'll go into Thursday in Saudi Arabia sort of reset. So that's the key for me.
Similar to Leclerc, isn't it? You know, Leclerc does this thing of flagellating himself when he doesn't think he's done a good enough job. But then it's, you know, back to the next session, back to the next race, and he gets on with it. I think maybe the key thing you said there, Ed, is Piastri's there at McLaren. That's the thing. It's the unknown of, is this the guy who's going to usurp Norris as that spearhead? Is he going to, just by sheer force of improvement and better results, going to be the guy that they start to pivot towards? Because that could unravel Norris. You know, Daniel Ricciardo was kind of part of a process of rebuilding Red Bull up, you know, from the drop of Vettel's 4 World Championships and hybrid F1, you know, nuking them a bit. And he looked like being the spearhead, and then Max Verstappen came along. And he didn't throw the team under the bus, Ricciardo, but he did get out. So there's that whole... There could be... I think you used the analogy before of a bit like the swan or the duck on the surface of the pond. You know, there's a lot of scrabbling going underneath, and Lando could be having all of these things going on in his head. But on the top level, it looks relatively serene. You know, Ricciardo maintained a pretty good veneer of, I'm pretty happy with my circumstances, but he could see which way the wind is blowing, and we're not there yet with McLaren, but that could really play into Norris. And if Piastri keeps putting him under more and more pressure, he might have more of these public unravelling moments and might find it harder to reset as well.
Or equally, it might go the other way.
True.
We will find out. Right, there's a question now for you, Mark, from Jake Wilkins. Is Lando Norris lucky to be leading the championship, and will he rue all those missed opportunities and mistakes at the end of the season? He's being outperformed by Piastri, Verstappen, Leclerc and Russell so far.
I wouldn't say lucky. He's there because he won in Australia, second in China and Japan, third in Bahrain, so there's merit there. But yes, of course, he could have done better. Will he rue those missed opportunities? If he loses the championship, of course, but he may not lose the championship. There's always that possibility. I feel there's a bit of a recency bias in how Norris is being assessed at the moment. But yeah, those 4 drivers have all given a more consistent performance in the 4 races so far. But it's just the ebb and flow of any set of races. It doesn't make it a permanent trait. You know, he made that quote about, it feels like I've never driven an F1 car before, and Lando being Lando, it's snowballed, and you know, but why might he not be feeling this car as well as he felt last year's? You know, he's got a different driving style to Oscar, which Ben talked about before, how much he overlaps a braking early part of the corner when the car allows it. It is a faster way of driving. It gets you the early rotation, allows you to begin leaning on the car earlier, but it needs the front of the car to be up to it. And there's something about this car, or this combination of car and the 25 front tyres, which are stiffer in the construction than last year's tyres, which is hurting the style. and the front of the car is just feeling numb to him, and it's just not allowing him to drive in his natural way. But there's, there is ongoing development, technical development, and there's ongoing, development of Norris's own technique. So I don't think you can take this freeze frame moment and say, all right, that's how this season's going to be.
I think this is absolutely pivotal to it, because that Norris seems to have this driving style that's much harder on the front, as you say, and then it's caused him some problems in some of the front limited races where he just can't keep the tyres alive. Whereas Piastri seems to do, I think, Ed, you were talking about this on a show we did recently, more of the sort of Prost 80s style of use the brakes to get the rotation and almost V the corner off. And it would seem to me that that's just working a bit better at the moment. So it could be that like Norris's level is being slightly masked by the fact that his way of driving isn't quite gelling with the tyres, isn't quite gelling with the car. And if they can just unlock that tiny difference, he could make a big step forward. And suddenly it's like, oh yeah, Lando Norris is back to like Zandvoort Lando Norris or Singapore Lando Norris. You did an interview with Jack Doohan at Alpine, tiny mechanical change at the rear of the car, and suddenly his feeling of the car is completely different to what it was before, and he unlocks many tenths of a second.
Yeah, that was basically less than a millimetre of toe-in taken out to make a huge difference. And he looked completely different after in Australia compared to where he was in Bahrain. It's amazing.
Drivers can be so sensitive to the tiniest things. And again, it's about this self-awareness and self-knowledge. If you know what you're particularly sensitive to or how you feel the car and what bits really make the difference in terms of feedback for you to go quicker, to lean on the car harder, extract more lap time, you can find so much time. And it could be the tiniest detail in the way the brakes behave or how that front end responds with the new construction of tyre. He could be one small step away from just unlocking a whole plane of performance that he just hasn't been able to live in so far.
I think it's also important to note that Norris has had a very strong season. If you're talking about performance, I think it's pretty much even between him and Piastri. And Mark, you mentioned recency bias. I also want to throw confirmation bias into the mix, because I think there's been this kind of, some have kind of got this prearranged narrative, where Piastri gets better than Norris and Norris is a bit weak. And it could go that way. That's still a possibility. But I think if it'd been the other way around in Australia and Norris had been the one who'd spun in rejoining and Piastri had got through and got into the pits, you said, that just shows in the crisis moments Norris made the mistake and couldn't gather it up, whereas Piastri was calm. So you've got to be really careful about kind of fitting it into a pre-approved narrative, which is why I keep saying we're going to find out, because I think we are still finding out exactly where all of this is. But I'd say it's a draw between Piastri and Norris so far this year, isn't it?
I'd agree. And if you look at Piastri's error in qualifying at Suzuka when he was the quickest guy there, that gave him third place on the grid and third place in the race, in a race that he should have won. He had more fundamental pace than Norris, but Norris put his ceiling on that weekend was lower than Piastri's, but he put his pieces together better, and he finished second as a result. So, I think because that doesn't fit into a narrative, it just doesn't get considered. But it's you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's still certainly a live question, because I think this Norris versus Piastri is a fascinating one, but neither is ahead at the moment.
I think Piastri also gets a bit of a free pass because of his relative inexperience compared to Norris. This is where it can play to your advantage, because mistakes are just more easily forgiven when you haven't been around as long. Because Norris is kind of the prevailing team leader, the guy who's expected to do all the winning because he's been around so long, because he's run at the front a bit longer, because he pushed Max a bit for the championship last year. He's just held to a higher standard naturally, I think, by people who are watching.
Right, the next question, and this is in your specialist subject area, Ben, as people who listen to Bring Back V10s will know. Joseph Pates says, is Lando Norris this generation's Damon Hill? I started following F1 in 2020 and was really rooting for Norris to have a good year in 25, which seems to be slipping away from him. After listening to a lot of Bring Back V10s, it feels like there might be some parallels to Damon Hill, a very likeable British driver who is honest and hard on himself, has some brilliant days when he is untouchable, and also has some weekends where he seemed lost.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison. I did wonder something similar to this after Australia, but only because of the way Verstappen was in that fight with the McLarens. That race reminded me of watching Michael Schumacher in a terrible bathtub Ferrari bothering the Williams cars, which are far superior. And it did feel a bit like you've got the superior driver and then the slightly inferior drivers, and it's kind of balancing out with the car differences. But apart from it being a broad brush comparison and, you know, the nationality being the same, I don't really see it. I do think that the overall level of the drivers at the front is higher now than it was then. And I think Norris is relatively fundamentally superior compared to Damon relative to his opposition. And as I think we've discussed at length, it's small details that are making the difference. I think if you put Lando in the 1996 Williams, yeah, he's going to win the championship, I'm sure. But I think also if you put him in the 1996 Ferrari, he would probably do a lot more with it than Damon would have done.
I think this is an interesting question, because I think if you focus on the kind of the honest and hard on himself, I would say there's a comparison in terms of, like I said, Norris isn't the classic psychology of the champion F1 driver. You could say the same with Damon Hill, who was a honest and sort of self-critical person who didn't have that impregnable self-belief, but kind of pushed him on to do incredible things. And so maybe there's a little bit of a comparison there, which does show you don't have to be the classic ruthless, completely self-absorbed character that fundamentally a selfish racing driver should be. So I can see some parallels there, and I think that's a positive thing because, well, as you'll know, Ben, you were a fan of Damon Hill in your youth, as was I, and he's proof that the notion of never meeting your heroes actually doesn't always apply, because
correct,
he is genuine, he is a person, a very likable, huge amount of respect for him, and he has he brings a humanity that some of the great champions not lack, but don't exhibit in the same way. So again, it just shows it's not a bad thing. Right, there's a question now along similar lines. The name field in the form didn't come up on this, so apologies, can't name who it is. I've just put no name at the top of it, but thanks for the question, whoever you are. Is it just me, or is Oscar Piastri just keeping calm and taking it race by race while Lando Norris is doing the same as Button in 2009 and tensing up as he feels the title pressure? I can see the comparison and why you made it. Yeah, I think it's a little bit different because Button did start to struggle in the middle of that season after the strong run. The championship pressure was part of it, but also the car was kind of going away from him a little bit. He was struggling more with it as well. I don't think Norris is at that point, because I just think you have to go a bit deeper into the season before that happens. But it could happen. But it shows that fighting for a world championship is extraordinarily difficult. People can say, oh, well, it's just sport or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's not war, or it's not real life. But it's everything to these people, and it's all consuming. And it takes a lot to deal with the intensity of that pressure, particularly, as we were saying earlier. It's like there's always a Grand Prix on, isn't there? 24 race weekends, six sprints on top of the 24 Grand Prix. So that pressure can start eating away at you. And Jensen certainly in 2009 did struggle a bit. He'll admit that after. He was he not lashed out at, but you could see he was getting a little bit chippy about some of the sort of public discourse on him in 2009. And that's understandable, because it was a weird situation and he was starting to struggle a bit with the characteristics of the Brawn. So in terms of the question, as we've said, yeah, Piastri is keeping it calm. I think I wouldn't say Lando Norris is feeling the title pressure as such yet, because I don't see any difference between what he's doing now and what he's done for years, really. he's doing the same thing. That the self-criticism, the honesty, the public comment, that's been Lando Norris. So isn't it a good thing? If he was standing up there pretending to be an impregnable, ruthless, 100% absolute, I'm always right person, we'd just be sat here saying,
what's happened?
I think he's trying to be something he's not.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not sort of trying to particularly build up Lando Norris here, but just sort of that sense of proportion, isn't it, in it? So it may be later on. I don't know how Norris will respond to being kind of a championship front runner. You don't know how anyone's really going to respond until they do it in F1. We don't know for sure how Piastri will. We can have an idea, but let's see how it plays out. Right, the final question in this section, Mark, from Ollie Barker. If Piastri keeps improving as he has season on season, will Norris have to raise his level to beat him over a season? Or is it a matter of just cutting out the mistakes while being pushed like Oscar?
I don't think there's a fundamental hierarchy between them. I think Piastri's more level, or has been this season, more robust, and Norris is more dependent on everything being just as he needs it to be with the car. But if he can get that, he can be devastating. So it's not so much raising his level, but accessing his level more consistently than he has done so far this season. I think Piastri's probably finished the steepest part of his improvement curve, is just now consistently, a world-class driver. But the amazing lap time beyond the car's natural level, that's something we've seen Lando do many more times than Oscar. So if he can tune into that, that's his weapon. Oscar's weapon is his flat line, emotionless, relentless performance.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is, because they're different drivers, Andrea Stella was talking about this at the weekend, they're good at pushing each other on because they have different strengths and different weaknesses. So we have got the classic case of two drivers who are putting pressure on each other, who are demonstrating to each other where there's time to improve. And I would say Norris, if you look at him, since he's come into F1, he's been quite good at experimenting with his technique and working and broadening his toolkit as a driver. So Piastri's presence could be a benefit for Norris. And if it sounds like we're hedging here, it's because we don't know. It's still playing out. And I think you've got to kind of look at it in broad terms. And I think this is fantastic because even if nobody else can be in championship contention, and obviously it'd be great if more teams were, there's the potential here for an intra-team battle that goes all the way with two very different characters, two very different drivers, and that could make for a fantastic season in itself. So lots of reason to be excited. It's certainly not a battle won just because Oscar Piastri won the Bahrain Grand Prix, but it might be. Who knows? It could be the start. We will not know until a bit down the line.
Out here, there's no one way of doing things, no unwritten rules, and no shortage of adventure. Because out here, the only requirement is having fun. Bank of America invites kids 6 to 18 to golf with us. For a limited time, sign them up for a free 1-year membership, giving them access to discounted tee times at thousands of courses. Learn more at bankofamerica.com/golf with us. What would you like the power to do? Bank of America. Restrictions apply. See BofA.com/golf with us for complete details. Copyright 2025 Bank of America Corporation.
Uh-oh. The last cookie.
You can get a new box of cookies in as fast as an hour with Walmart Express Delivery.
Are you my guilty self-conscience?
No, I'm the voice offering you promo code EXPRESS for free delivery on your first order.
Hey, who ate my cookies?
You mean, these cookies?
Order now. Welcome to your Walmart. Promotion valid for first express delivery order. $50 minimum subject to availability. Restrictions apply.
Season 1 of Andor had critics calling it the best Star Wars series yet. Now, Season 2 of the Emmy-nominated series returns April 22nd. Follow Cassian Andor as he embarks on a path from a rebel to a hero. Starring Diego Luna and from creator Tony Gilroy, writer of Michael Clayton and The Bourne Identity. Season 2 of Andor is streaming April 22nd, only on Disney+.
Right, in the final part now, we're going to go a little bit more all across the board on topics. So, Mark, a question from Andrew Narduzzi. Given how much the Red Bull struggled in Bahrain, which other circuits this year do we anticipate the Red Bull struggling at? The contrast between Japan and Bahrain seems to illustrate how peaky the Red Bull may be over the course of the year.
Yes, any circuit which tyre deg's heavy will really punish the Red Bull, as it is in its current state of development. Suzuka had unexpectedly low tyre deg because of that very smooth new surface up through the S's, and all of a sudden it was right there. So any track at which tyre deg is not a big issue, and particularly if that's combined with a layout that rewards braking performance, which the Red Bull has, Max will be able to work his magic. But any track with long corners rather than short, sharp ones is going to constrain him to the level of any other driver, and that the car needs to be capable of creating the extra headroom for a genius to be the differentiator. So short corners, low tyre deg, that's a Red Bull track. Long corners, high tyre deg, there's your false ceiling, and that'll be disastrous for Red Bull, those sort of tracks.
Ben, now a question from Daryl Finch. Which non-McLaren driver has the best shot at challenging them for the title? Max Verstappen or George Russell?
Yeah, I'd say Max Verstappen is probably the most likely from a driving point of view, but I just don't think the car's going to get there. I feel like without troubleshooter extraordinaire Adrian Newey there, they'll just be stuck in this cycle of it not being quite there and Max just having to do his heroics. So probably Russell is the interloper. I'm not sure he's not at the Verstappen level, but the Mercedes seems close enough that if they can have a good season of development and close the gap a little bit, he might be able to get involved. I certainly think he's performing well enough to. So he's probably the more likely, just because I feel like, as Mark said, the Red Bull's going to hold Max back probably more often than it's going to allow him to do genius things, because I don't feel like there's too many circuits with short corners and low deck that are going to allow him to kind of, be the genius differentiator.
Yeah, certainly. Both Verstappen and Russell have been outstanding this season, but yeah, I'd agree. Verstappen probably more likely the one to be the miracle worker, probably because Red Bull's got a bit. If they can troubleshoot, I'm not sure they will. It could stay on McLaren, but it's close enough that it could change. It's going to be dictated by the cars.
You need Verstappen in the Merc, basically, don't you? We're not going to get that this year.
Yeah, exactly. Right, a question from AP Gray. Might this be a season where consistency and having a high floor, metaphorically speaking, is more crucial than ever in the championship? It feels like a different sort of championship to recent years. Yeah, well, I think what the question's getting at is the fluctuations in form, which... The way I tend to conceptualise it is there's a few more limitations to bounce off with these ground effect cars. It's almost a more three-dimensional problem, whereas with the old cars, you could just keep throwing on downforce as long as it was consistent and worked and didn't stall, you gain performance. Whereas here, you can put load on and you can lose characteristics, so it's all in that sort of fine control. Hence, you can have... The McLaren's been the best car every race so far, but the Red Bull was the second best car, clearly, at Suzuka. It was the fourth best car, you would say, in Bahrain. So there are those fluctuations, and yeah, you want a car that ideally on a good day is winning, and on a bad day is sort of second or third best, don't you, rather than fluctuating back and forward. So is it more crucial than ever? I mean, you want consistency and you want a car that can perform very well, but you need kind of an all-rounder, I think, probably is the best way to put it. So yeah, it's a hard one to answer, but it is a different sort of championship as this era of cars anyway, because when you do get cars of a similar level of performance, I think there's more reason to think they'll flip in and out of competitiveness with various characteristics, which I think is quite interesting. It's just ideally, for that to play out properly, we need the Red Bull and the Mercedes and the Ferrari to be as quick, and then you will see that ebb and flow. But I'm still interested to see what happens when we get to, say, Monaco, because the mechanical platform of the Ferrari, just in terms of the pure slow speed mechanical performance, seems to be pretty good still. So could the Ferrari win at Monaco? Maybe. So yeah, interesting question. Mark, a question from Ben Saint. Do Mercedes have any upgrades coming? And if so, could they bring George Russell into the championship fight?
I'm sure they will have, but I have no specific knowledge of what. I think it'll be a stretch, though, to make the Mercedes into a regular McLaren beater, but you never know. Mercedes seems to have gone down a different development path with this car to that of the last few years, because the last little bit of downforce now comes with so many balance problems, which you were talking about before. It's as if they've stopped chasing that and have just accepted a lower level of downforce and concentrated on making their car as efficient as possible at that level. Hence, you see them running less wing than the others this year, being fastest down the straights, not getting into plank trouble or balance issues. They seem to have found a sweet spot in that middle ground. But I think going from there to McLaren levels of performance would potentially take them out of that sweet spot. And McLaren have found that balanced sweet spot compromise at a higher downforce level than anyone else. And I think it would take a long time for Mercedes to get to that level. Could be wrong, of course.
Yeah, they might just look at it as well and say, pursuing a small chance of catching McLaren and compromising 26 wouldn't be wise for them. But if they can stay consistent all year, they could finish second in the Constructors' Championship, pick off a few race wins when McLaren don't nail it. So maybe that's the approach they'll take. Right, Ben, a question from Andrew Heyer. Is Russell ready to fight for the championship? And connected to that, Richard Matera says Russell is looking like a true team leader. Is George the best bargain on the grid for the performance he consistently delivers? I'm sure George Russell's telling Toto Wolff that, so you need to pay me more.
I don't know how much he's paid, so I don't know if he's a bargain or not. I mean, he is ready, isn't he? We've said before that core ingredients looked like they were there, and I think last year he put it all together and was emphatically better than Lewis Hamilton. We don't need to get back into a Lewis Hamilton dead rubber season with Mercedes, but I think that was the kind of probably the final psychological piece for George. It's like, actually, I emphatically am the top guy here now, and he's just carried that on. He looks like everything you need, really. Quick, consistent, reliable. Probably, as Mark was explaining, the car's helping him. I think this idea that Mercedes have kind of given up trying to go properly down into the, floor bouncing back destroying window of downforce generation and just gone, well, actually, we did quite well when we were at higher ride heights. Let's just focus on that and making the car consistent and then work around that. Seems to be paying off because now he's got the consistent platform. He's able to drive more consistently and show more of himself more often. I mean, he certainly should be pushing hard for that new contract, and he's making Toto's life difficult, isn't he? Because if Toto retains that interest in Max Verstappen, and Max Verstappen is as unhappy with the current state of play at Red Bull as seems to be indicated by Helmut Marko, then he's got that same old problem of how does he fit the driver he really wants in with a guy who he can't get rid of because he's performing too well, versus the young kid who he also really believes in but has had a slightly, as you'd expect, rocky start, given that he's on the beginning of the tyre management learning curve that Piastri's kind of on the end of now.
Yeah, I'd certainly endorse the idea that Russell's ready to fight for a championship. I think it's only 4 races, but if we were to be doing a top 10 drivers of the season, I think Russell would be a contender for top spot. Verstappen would be as well. So, yeah, I think Russell's up there. Right, a question from Tim Ursel that I'll take. Liam Lawson has had another torrid weekend and race. Do you think he can recover any form, or is it a matter of time before we see Lindblad in the Racing Bulls? Well, I think Lawson will definitely get better. His pace has been decent. He's had a little bit of bad luck in the 2 races. He would have been in Q2 had the DRS not closed, which admittedly he could have been on for, because according to the team, he had a bit of wheel spin in that the traction zone coming out of turn 10, and because the DRS zone starts so early on that straight, he was in the DRS zone, so he lifted and it shut, and just lack of familiarity with the car, he forgot that.
But if he was in the Alpine, then it wouldn't have shut, would it?
Exactly, yeah. It depends from car to car. So I'm sure Lawson will recover form, and Lawson will get back to what he can be, which I think is, I suspect his sort of level in F1 is sort of handy midfield driver, not superstar, and that's going to make him vulnerable. I'd be surprised if there's a way back to Red Bull racing, simply because Red Bull have always said whenever they've demoted someone, publicly they say there's a chance, but I know the feeling internally is don't go back once you've rejected someone. Lindblad, maybe. He's not 18 until August. He's very highly rated, but he needs to probably produce a little bit more consistency. He's had sort of an okay start to the F2 season, and I know you can look at the example of Antonelli and Behrman and say, well, what does F2 have to do with anything? But I'm sure they're leaning towards promoting Lindblad, but I wouldn't say it's a foregone conclusion he can't be in before late in the season this year anyway. And I don't even think it's a foregone conclusion he'll be in the car next year. They might want to just let him play his way in through F2 and then be in down the line. So I think Lawson's got time. He will recover form. He will score points this year. Give him a bit of a chance to fully settle in. And I think he'll be fine. Right, Mark, a question from James Atkinson now. Do you think age is to blame for Lewis Hamilton's qualifying deficits? The man can clearly still race, but starting lower down the grid than he should is holding him back. And it's a big change in fortunes for a man with 104 pole positions.
It may be age, but I think the verdict's still out on that. Those 104 pole positions came in cars to which he was attuned. This one doesn't allow him to drive in his natural way. Aggressive oversteer on entry, mid-corner understeer, a bit like the Red Bull. And without the familiarity of feel for the tools and the various systems on the car to counter that, I think if we see him in a car which allows him to drive in his natural way and he's still a couple of tenths off Charles Leclerc, then yeah, we'd have to conclude that age is probably the culprit. But last year, Silverstone and Spa, this year in the China Sprint, he was super fast. And I think if it was age, it wouldn't be stuttery like that. His form wouldn't stutter about like that. It would just be a more consistent underperformance. These patches of raw speed don't seem to correlate with it being an age thing. But let's see how he goes when, hopefully, Ferrari sorts out its car. So then we'll have a more definitive take on it.
I have a supplementary question then, Mark. Because what you described there, the Ferrari being an entry oversteer, mid-corner understeer car and that holding Lewis back, that sounds very much like the 2024 Mercedes. So has Ferrari just basically turned their car into the 2024 Mercedes?
Yeah, well, it's an occupational hazard with this generation of cars. You chase more downforce. That's the way that they become unbalanced because of the way the aero center of pressure moves, under braking and moves back again the other way as you level off the brake. So that's what you've got to either conquer or surrender to in the case of Mercedes this year and just not be quite so ambitious. So McLaren have conquered it, Mercedes have surrendered, and Ferrari's still fighting, as is Red Bull.
I think also there's still a question about the generic characteristics of this era of cars and whether it's well suited to Hamilton as well, or whether he can adapt. I think the only area where I would say you can say there would be some element of age being a factor is just generically, as drivers get older, sometimes the adaptability gets a little bit narrower. You hear a lot of stories of that.
Yeah.
And I suspect a younger Hamilton would maybe find it easier to adapt the style. I think probably that there's a hint of that. So I don't think it's a loss of skill, but I just think that's the one thing we know with age does sometimes narrow, because you've got
you get stuck in your ways.
Well, it is a bit of that, but in a way, it's all of this experience of what works in the past. And I guess we all suffer from that, don't we? When you get stuck in your ways, it's normally because you found a really good way of doing things that works for that particular way now. And then you always want it to be that way because you've kind of wired yourself because that works well. And it's hard to do. I think if people think about examples in their day-to-day lives, if you've been around for a bit, you do run into these little things. And I don't think it's an intransigence. I think it's just the nature of the way you build up skill sets and get used to things and optimize and muscle memory and all of these things. So that's the only thing. I don't think there will be some decline with age somewhere, but if he's on that curve or where, no way of telling. Certainly there's no evidence that age in that regard is the problem for him just getting slower, if you see what I mean. Right, question for you, Ben, from Adam Ryle. Wait, does Pierre Gasly's qualifying and race pace validate the direction taken by Alpine, and just how competitive would they have been with a Mercedes engine? And is Doohan doomed? He showed good pace in flashes but lacked the consistency and final touch.
Well, to take the last part of it first, I don't think he's doomed. I think he's shown really quite strong underlying pace, even though it hasn't translated into results yet and will have to. I think he's impressed enough that Alpine are kind of happy to persist with him for a bit longer. And, if he only had 6 races, I think he's got more than 6 races now before they'll consider putting Colapinto in. And as we said before, he made that small, tiny geometry tweak to the car and suddenly he's more comfortable. And he's quite close to Gasly on pure pace, isn't he? He's not stringing it together, but he's certainly quick enough behind the wheel. And I think Gasly has been outstanding in that team, from the second half of last year right through. I think Carlos Sainz said if they had the Mercedes engine already, he would have been on the front row, wouldn't he, in Bahrain? So, he's definitely driving at a high level. The car seems to be good at its peak, even if it's got a few efficiency problems and obviously still the prevailing engine problem. And I think the fact that Doohan, behind the scenes seems to be able to drive quite close to Gasly's level without actually yet producing the results suggests that, if Gasly is performing as well as we think he is, then Doohan must be doing a pretty good job and therefore there's no reason to bin him off too soon.
Yeah, I've sort of been impressed by Doohan in some areas. The pace has been good. It's a bit frustrating things haven't come together for him, and he had 2/3 of a very good race. What do you make of Doohan, Mark? Do you think that he's going to kind of coalesce into a more consistent driver? I don't see him as a superstar in the making, but he's certainly got pace, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think if he's given a chance, and you will see a much more representative picture, and I think that picture will show him to be a very handy driver who's, if you give him the car, he's fully capable of, getting podiums, and if like we would go for the what if they had the Mercedes engine and they say the 3/10 off with engine, and so with that engine would have a front running car. If they had that front running car, he's perfectly capable of running at the front. I think not every time because he's just a rookie, but yeah, I think he has that sort of underlying pace. Yes.
Yeah, we talk about the whole question about the direction of Alpine on that Mercedes engine in a exclusive members podcast I did with Samath Kanal, in which I think the short version of what I said was that I don't think from a Renault perspective shutting down the engine project showed any seriousness or ambition, but from a pure racing team perspective, given Renault couldn't deliver the engine, I think it does validate it for Alpine. So those might sound like contradictory positions, but my first choice would be a works team, do it properly. But if you're not going to do that, then from the pure race team perspective, then that will be an upgrade. Well, thanks very much for those questions to everyone who sent them in. Thanks very much to Ben and Mark for your answers. We've got the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix coming up, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.